So I'm Janelle Baily, and I am at Temple University. And um, my history with this column is it's actually my first ever published article was not in the AstroNotes column, but it was for the physics teacher at Tim Slater's behest. So I literally started off graduate school working with him, and I said, "I'm here. I've got my ID. I've got my office keys. Now what do I do?" And he said, "Write this article for me on this topic." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And I did. And then it got published for a special issue that physics teacher did, um, on where the whole issue was focused on astronomy, because that was when we did one of our joint meetings with the American Astronomical Society. And um, so it's the journal itself, and then the column has always been kind of a love of mine in terms of, just kind of what it wants to do and stuff like that. So it was really a joy to see Gordon and Joe and the committee work to put it back in place and to get going again. And it's been lovely to work on it with Joe and then now Dawn. So thanks. And so I'm at Temple. I do astronomy education research, but I don't teach physics or astronomy at all anymore. So it's always just a little bit distal for me to do it, but that's part of why I love it, right? Because it keeps me connected with the community. Don, on the other hand, has lots of experience with these types of courses, and I'll let him tell you about himself.
Yeah, so I'm at Guilford College, which is a small liberal arts college in North Carolina. We've got, I think, about 1,200 students, very small physics program. We used to have something like 15 physics majors, and now it's more like 5. But that means I get to teach a lot of general education courses, and I'm always looking for interesting and creative ways to do that. And I was on the space science. My research background's astrophysics, but I've always been excited about teaching. And I was on the space science committee when Joe proposed resurrecting the column. And I tried to be supportive of him in those years when he was doing it by himself. And I wrote a few of the columns. And when he said he was going to step down, I thought, oh, I'd love to step in and help there. And got the chance to work with Janelle, which was great. And yeah, so I feel like I came from the astronomy research world, but now I'm much more of a teacher. And being active with TPT and with AstroNotes in particular has helped me really expand my repertoire of ideas.
Awesome. So what we thought we'd do is just tell you a little bit of background about kind of why the column exists, what we've written, what's been published before, and then what the submission and review process looks like. And then we anticipate having some time that if you have specific ideas that you'd like to talk about in terms of like a cool idea that you'd like to see written, or that you'd like to write, it would be our ideal is that you write it, or ideas that you'd like to read about, then we've got some time to kind of brainstorm and talk about those things a little bit. So why is there an AstroNotes column? Well, the origins of it, as I understand, and I think we've kind of continued this model, was that, a lot of physics instructors find themselves teaching astronomy at some point. Astronomy is in this weird place, right? In the K-12 world, it is lumped with Earth and space or with Earth science courses, which not a lot of those exist. They tend to be middle school Earth science and occasionally a high school Earth science class. And then at the college level, they tend to be with the physics departments. So it lives in this weird world between Earth and space or geoscience and physics, depending on the focus and who's doing it. Even within the professional astronomy community, right? The division of planetary sciences tends to meet separately from the main part of the AAS, because the planetary world and the everything other than planetary worlds, just to kind of approach it so differently. And so with a lot of physics people finding themselves having to teach astronomy, but probably not having been trained in it, the original idea for AstroNotes was to kind of to help out those folks with giving them ideas about resources, curriculum, lessons, um, uh, various pedagogy, that sort of thing that would help them better teach astronomy. Now, many of us that have written for it really come more from an astronomy background than a physics background, but I think that's why it works well, right? Is because we can say, look, this is how you can do it, and here's where you can make connections with physics to bring it into physics classes as well. But again, the idea is really kind of aimed at the folks who don't have necessarily the training in astronomy, but come at it from the physics world instead. So we just pulled together a quick list. These are some of the titles of publications that have happened. I think these were, Joe, since you took over, I don't think this includes any of the original timeline. But you can see there's a pretty broad mix of things. We have a cosmic perspective timeline. So looking at, like, how long ago did these various big events happen? Apps for teaching astronomy. That particular one is a relatively old article, so I'm sure it would be like totally new and redone. Things about Galileo's telescope, imaging planets, forces. Andy Fracknoy wrote about his free textbook and OER hub. We've had mass luminosity relationships, solar system objects. I don't remember the year, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of related to Pluto and its motion and those sorts of fun things. A group of us wrote an article relating to the 2017 solar eclipse. I imagine we may see some more eclipse stuff coming up. Apparent retrograde motion of the planets, teaching about space exploration and blind and visually impaired accessing software, and various things like that. So there are a lot of different possibilities here. And we try to keep it as open and broad as possible.
And Janelle, can I jump in to reinforce
Please.
something there? As you said, this is a pretty broad representative sample of what we've got going on, but they do tend to fall, I think, into three categories. They tend, and you can see it right here, they tend to be, here's a resource that you might not know about that you could use, usually with some kind of lesson plan attached to it. Here's something you could try in your classroom, like here's something you could get the students to image with a telescope, or here's an activity you could do with the students that would help them, understand this concept better. Or they tend to be, sometimes we get articles that are like, here's a different way of thinking about teaching that might help you teach astronomy. Janelle, you wrote an article recently about words that give people trouble because they have special meanings in astronomy that don't necessarily track with how the words are used in day-to-day language. And so I think, if you're thinking about what you might want to publish in AstroNotes, those are three great questions to ask. Do you have an activity that you think would help people understand something better? Do you have a resource that you like to use that you think other people should know about? Or is there a thought you want to share about how we teach that would be helpful for people to know about? Janelle, does that seem like a good taxonomy?
It does. Yeah, I think that's a really nice summary. And the one other thing that I'll add to that, because it's kind of tricky with resources, is we always try to be very cautious about commercially available things, because we don't want it to necessarily be an ad. That being said, we are more interested in, or more willing to do that when the authors can talk about how things are embedded in the class. So for example, one of the places where we've done that recently was Kendra Sibberson wrote about the unistellar telescope. And one of the things we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just an ad for this telescope, but rather she was part of the initial grant that got the, an early version of it, and this is how she's used it in the classes. And I think that turned out to be a really nice column. Some of the other activities, like this one, not quite like the movies, that has activities, but those are freely available. You don't have to pay for them. So that's one of the things that we just had to take a little bit of a cautious approach on, in terms of resources. So just kind of be aware of that.
But we had there was an article about the JS9, the web-based interface for analyzing astronomy images. But the focus of that was here's some activities you can do with your students and using this tool. And there was another one about an archive of infrared data. Janelle, do you remember that one? It was through Caltech, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yeah. From Louisa Ribble, the ITARP, no, the NITARP program is the teacher professional development. What was the companion piece that went, IRTF database, I think.
So the emphasis was on here's activities you can, labs you can do with your students using this interesting database, not an ad for the database.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely.
And that database is free, so less concerned about that one, but than something like the Unistellar telescope, for example. But anyway, good things to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So
I think that telescope was probably the closest we got to an ad, but even then it wasn't that close.
yeah, exactly. So if you were interested in writing, what do you need to know? So the length tends to be around 1,000 to 1,200 words. We'll say if you've got more figures, then the text should be shorter, because all of this needs to fit on 2 pages of layout. Okay, so nominally about 1,000 words is kind of the goal. If there's not much in the way of figures, we can go a little bit higher, that sort of thing. The focus, as we said, was astronomy pedagogy, especially that which is useful for physics teachers. And this can be at the high school, 2-year college, or 4-year college levels. As you may know, the physics teacher in general is aimed at high school and introductory college courses, whether TYC or 4-year. And so we want to think about astronomy at the same levels, right? So we're not going to be publishing something that you would use in a 300 level advanced course, which I'm guessing there's not a ton of those offered at 2-year colleges anyway. So I think most of the courses that you're dealing with within the optics community would fit very well with the AstroNotes column. We definitely want to make sure you're writing clear, direct scientific English with active voice, right? I think one challenge that we have with writing is that, particularly those of us of a certain age, were kind of taught that the best way for academic writing is this kind of third person, distant, passive voice type stuff. And one, that's no longer really the norm, and two, it's incredibly boring to read about an article or an activity that you want to do in class in this distant thing, right? We want to know that you've done it. We want to know what your experiences were doing this thing, and why you think it's valuable. So feel free to use the words I and we and make it active and tell us what you did. 1 to 2 tables or figures are good. Small tables, large tables probably aren't appropriate. Now, the one caveat for that is that we can use supplemental materials. Supplemental materials are additional resources that are published online but don't go into the physical journal, and they're not part of the main article, they're just linked. Okay, so we have had, for example, people have written up something like the lab activity, and then the student handout for the lab might be a supplemental material, or additional figures, or a large table of a data set that you might use in the activity could be published as supplemental materials. And so that's a possibility. 1 or 2 figures, though, is great. 3 to 10 references is probably the most common in TPT style, and I've linked there the information for authors. Hey, Don, could you grab that off the slides and throw that in the chat?
Sure.
And so this is so one of the challenges that we find is that, you know, when I teach science teaching methods courses for future science teachers, I tell them, you know, we beg, borrow, and steal from everywhere, right? No teacher makes up brand new lessons from scratch every day. It's just, it's not humanly possible. We don't have that much kind of time. And unless Hermione has shown up with her time turner, it's just not happening, right? So you got to think about what's been done before that you can build on. And so looking to see what has been published, particularly in TPT, but outside it as well, is always good practice, just as it would be, you know, in doing science. If you find yourself like, hey, there's this article that looks like it might be similar to mine, but I don't have access to it for some reason, let us know and we'll get it for you. Now, theoretically, I'm hoping that everybody here is an AAPT member, in which case you should have access to everything from TPT online. But in case you're not, or in case you share this with other people who aren't AAPT members and they need access, we're happy to help get you any examples that you might need. TPT style is a pretty commonly used in science, you know, so it's a kind of end note style, you know, using superscript numbers and all the references at the end with abbreviated journal titles and that sort of thing. And that's something that we can help you with if you're not familiar, but definitely take a look at the instructions to authors and past examples and see what it looks like.
The references, that's something I tend to focus on, just because I think the nature of the column is such that people tend to, you know, they're not research papers, they're ideas that people have, and they tend to you know, write them down as they appear in the head, and then they think, well, I don't have to go look and see if anybody's done this before because I made it up. But I really want articles that are embedded in the published literature and are aware of what other people have done.
Agreed. So let's say got this idea, you write us up, you know, 1,028 words or whatever it is, and you've got your figures, you got your citations, and you're ready to submit it. Then what do you do? Okay. So we have created a Google form for you to submit in advance so that because we can usually get to it a little bit faster than if you go through the physics teacher submission process. Now, if you forget all of this and you go to the physics teacher and you submit through their portal and you say that it's for AstroNotes, it will get to us. That's not a problem. But before that was happening, we created this Google form. And so Don, if you'd throw that link in the chat as well, that'd be awesome. It's a pretty quick little form. It asks for your name, your affiliation, your email address. It's got an optional box if you've got anything that you want to tell us or questions you want to ask, and then a spot to upload up to 5 files. And we just recently changed that. It originally was only 1 file. But as we've suggested supplemental materials for several people lately, and I thought, you know, it'd be awfully nice if they could just submit that in the same spot. So we recently changed that. So you upload your files, we get an email saying, hey, somebody submitted. And when we do that, then we'll take a look at it. We try to get to it within a week or 2. As you might imagine, depending on what's going on in our lives, that can vary a little bit. But if we know we're going to be a little bit, we'll try to get back to you and let you know that. And we look at it and we provide feedback. And so generally the 2 outcomes are, we really like this, but we think it needs some edits. And sometimes those edits are very small and minor. Sometimes it's pretty big. And we'll work with you through multiple rounds of revision if it's still going in the right direction. We think that it's going to be appropriate. Or if we think it's not right for the column, we'll reject it. We'll provide a little bit of feedback on why. And if it's possible, we may suggest other venues to consider. So some examples for this might be like, let's say it's just too long and you can't cut it down and we think it needs to be as long as it does. We might say you might want to think about this to the physics teacher more broadly. Or there's a relatively new journal called Astronomy Education Journal that has both research articles but also best practice articles, and might be a possibility to publish there. So we'll try to give you a little bit of feedback if we can, but a rejection is really it's mostly about the fit with the column more than anything else. Okay, we hope to see you successful. We would like to, we generally see this as kind of a formative process and try to work with you to improve things. Once it gets to where Don and I agree that this is ready to go, then we have you go submit it to the physics teacher's submission system so that it gets tracked through their production process. And that's a new thing since Joe is in charge. That's relatively new. And then at some point, Jane Chambers takes it and makes it all pretty and lays it out in the format of the journal, and then they give it back to either you or through us. I think increasingly, because we're putting it through the TPT submission system, it's going back to the authors directly. But sometimes it comes to us as well, where both you and Don and I get to take a look at it and just make sure everything looks nice before it goes into production. As Don mentioned earlier, it's about, we were supposed to submit by the 10th of the month, 2 months before the issue. So November 10th is the nominal due date for the January issue, for example. So if you get accepted, it can be a relatively fast turnaround. In terms of publication.
We are much faster than the regular journal. I think that we had one submission came in toward the middle of the month and we thought it was great and needed very little work, and we got it. It was in 2 months later, it was already out, so and then there are other articles where we spend months going back and forth till we're happy with it. But even then, I had an article where I'd submitted before I took over, being co-editor with Janelle. I had submitted an article to Joe, and I had submitted a regular TPT article a full year before, and they both came out in the same issue. So the turnaround time for AstroNotes is much quicker than a regular TPT article.
That may be true for other columns as well, I'm not sure. And when Don says some of them have taken months, to be fair, the months is not months worth of working on it. It was revised, give it a review, give it back to the authors. They take 3 months before they get the revisions back to us, type of thing. And it wasn't like 3 months of actively working on it every couple of days kind of thing. So
definitely not.
All right, so that's kind of the big picture. We threw the submission link that's on this page. Don put that in the chat for us a little bit earlier. I also put our email address. And so as promised, what we thought we would do now is just do some brainstorming, some feedback on ideas. It looks like our numbers have stayed relatively small. We lost one person who started off with us, but we have gained a new attendee. And so I will stop sharing the slides and we can just take a little bit to talk about, like, what ideas do you have? Do you have ideas that you might like to see, that you'd like to think about writing for us?